Hello everyone, welcome to the third week of lectures in Principles of Macroeconomics. Today we are going to be talking about supply, demand and equilibrium, but from a heterodox perspective. In the last few weeks, we have been talking about the mainstream or the neoclassical interpretation of supply, demand and equilibrium, and we have been noticing how this framework is used over and over again throughout the textbooks in Principles of Macro and Principles of Micro. However, a key aspect of these are discussing the limitations of the supply-demand framework, because it is almost considered as a holy grail in understanding economics around the world, and that is the point that heterodox approaches or heterodox critiques challenge, because of many of the underlying aspects of this framework that actually are not suited to understanding what is happening in the world around us. So let's begin. A short recap. We already know that the upward sloping blue line represents the supply curve, the downward sloping orange line represents the demand curve. The question is that when there is a market equilibrium, how will you find it? This will be at the intersection of the supply and demand curve, and in this graph it is at 6 and 50 for quantity and prices respectively. The story doesn't stop here though. There is an idea that the market has a self-correcting mechanism. What does that mean? Suppose you're at a point somewhere here in this range. This means that you have an excess demand for the product as compared to the supply. The idea here is that you are going to have a pressure on prices to go up. And that pressure is what is going to induce us back to the equilibrium. So in that sense, markets can never have a disequilibrium by construction itself, because you're always going to have this correcting mechanism. Now, what really defines these graphs or this framework is the underlying assumptions in the neoclassical supply-demand framework. We'll talk about these assumptions now. At least 3 of these assumptions are what we would like to challenge in the forthcoming slides, and we'll discuss them one by one. The first assumption is that of perfect foresight. Now, remember the time we derived these supply and demand curves. The way we derived them was by actually going into the micro foundations of how people think about how much to produce and how much to produce and how much to buy on the market. So basically, you have individuals who are utility maximizing agents, and they would know how much quantity to demand at a given price. There would be suppliers who will know how much quantity to sell at a given price. If you think about our classroom, for example, and I were somebody who was ready to buy, let's say, 10 cookies, and I was ready to give you $100. If I were to ask you this question or give you this proposal, many of you will come up with yes or no answers. Many of you will tell me that you would like to have more than $100. Many of you would be ready to sell me cookies for $100 and so on. In that case, if I were to chart down all of your responses and draw a graph aggregating your responses, that will basically give me one of these components. Basically, in this case, since you are the supplier of the good, that's going to give me the supply curve. On the other hand, and I think we will play this game in the next class, if I were to ask you to demand a certain product, or what is going to be the price that you will pay in terms of, let's say, an auction kind of a thing, and aggregate all this together, that is going to give me the demand curve in the neoclassical sense. So basically, a large part of the macroeconomics frameworks is derived from its micro foundations. And if you think about it, we discussed this a little bit previously, but if you think about it, this has a lot of repercussions. This falls under the idea of the fallacy of composition, and if I don't know if people are familiar with the term paradox of thrift, which was coined by many economists, Keynes himself included. But the idea basically is that what is true of the individual might not be true of the sum of all the individuals, or the sum of the parts might not have the same behavior and outcome as the individual himself or herself. The idea being that for paradox of thrift, if each one of us saves and invests, that is probably good for us to grow. But if we all do it together, then the economy will not have anybody to consume any products, which probably means that there will be less production and demand will decline. So what is again good for the individual might not be true or well represented at the aggregate. The second important idea is that the neoclassical framework requires an auctioneer to start the game. So like I was telling you about these experiments that we could do in the classroom, I'm going to be the auctioneer who tells you what is going to be the starting price and quantity. Until I tell you about these so-called endowments, it will be difficult to start this game. The neoclassical framework does not tell us who's the auctioneer exactly, but says that once the ball starts rolling, it's going to be people who are going to learn from prices, because prices are sort of going to be the tool that determines how people correct their behavior and move towards an equilibrium. The third assumption that they make is about instantaneous adjustment. We talked about this briefly, but the idea is that there will be no disequilibrium in the market, and even if there is, it's going to be very temporary. So there is no chance that you're going to have permanent supply demand lagging, or there's no chance basically of not reaching the equilibrium quantity of supply and demand. Now, having seen this, let's break down or deconstruct some of these assumptions. Let's start with the assumption of perfect foresight. We look at what happens if there is imperfect foresight. So here's the classic demand-supply framework, but there's one change here. I have introduced a gray dotted demand curve, which is lower than the actual demand curve. This gray dotted demand curve is basically the wrong demand curve, or the demand curve that I got by miscalculating. I basically went to Consum data and I figured out that this is what the demand curve is, when in reality it is the orange line. Now, if I am a business owner or a firm which makes certain products, I would be thinking that if this is the demand curve, then my quantity of production, or how much I would be willing to produce or supply, is going to be somewhere between 4 and 6, most likely 5. Now, what does the neoclassical framework suggest? It suggests that if I have miscalculated and this is the quantity I have produced, then there will be a push towards increase in prices, which means that automatically I will come back to the equilibrium. However, my point of contention is that this is a very static way of looking at how markets function. The reason being that if I am a supplier of a commodity in an industry, my behavior or my decision to supply less is also going to have repercussions on firms or businesses who are in the same industry, and even firms and businesses who are outside the industry. In fact, if there is this pessimistic attitude that demand is very low, all firms in the industry might actually cut down on production. And if that happens, it means that there is going to be a chance that demand keeps falling even further, because you're not hiring people, you're cutting down on production, people will not be demanding the goods that are being sold on the market, and this kind of a herd behavior might happen. The classic static framework of neoclassical supply demand does not really help us get to this dynamism in the market. To represent what I just talked about, we are talking about a case where demand can continue to spiral downwards in the absence of market correction. A small case study about this. So imagine a situation where you are the CEO of a large automobile firm. Automobile industry in the US is probably prone to shocks, both positive and negative demand shocks. Your market analytic expert team that you have, that tells you about what is the demand for your products, makes an error judgment and basically believes that the demand is lower than expected. As the CEO, you decide to cut down on the production, and this behavior is something that firms within your automobile sector and firms outside your sector can see. Two questions that you can think about is, how will the other firms react to this decision, and is there a reason to expect that there will be an instantaneous adjustment, or is there a reason to expect that this error could be exacerbated over time? Next, we will move on to another example, and this time we are going to talk about what happens if price expectations are elastic. We have talked a little bit about elasticity. Here the idea is that if suppose there has been a change in price in the current period, and my expectations are that in future this change will be replicated again and again, then that will affect the way I make my decisions. Again, this is a classic supply and demand curve, but for a moment I want you to pay attention and think about this as a framework to analyze labor markets, because neoclassical macroeconomics does that a lot. There is not much of a distinction between what happens in the labor market as compared to what happens in the commodity market, at least in the introductory courses. So if there is, let's say, a shift in the supply of labor, here I'm plotting the demand and supply of labor. If, let's say, the supply of labor shifts downwards, which means an increase in labor supply, that means that the immediate outcome of that, given this analysis, is that wage rate, which is the price of labor, that's what's on the y-axis, is going to go down, and firms will be incentivized to hire more people, right? That is the main idea. However, if I'm a firm owner and my price expectations are elastic, then I might think that, okay, the wage rate has gone down, there might be further increases in supply of labor, and the wage rate might keep going down again in future. So why not wait and see how low the wage rate can go? And instead of actually hiring more people, I might be incentivized to reduce the number of people I'm hiring. In other words, if not just one firm but many firms do this across the market, the labor demand curve might shift downwards. And if you notice, the equilibrium between the new labor demand curve, which has shifted downwards, and the new supply curve shows that the wage rate has declined, right, on the y-axis, but the equilibrium employment, or the quantity of people who are employed, that has not changed. So there is a possibility again of a dynamic flow in supply and demand, which the neoclassical framework cannot explain, at least in its very basic form. Again, a small case study. Imagine a situation where labor supply increases due to immigration. You're the hiring manager of the firm. You look at your textbooks of supply and demand, and you say that equilibrium wage has declined, so I can actually hire more workers, you think. But a second, you decide to wait. The source of your information, which told you that labor supply increase, tells you that there might be future increases as well. In other words, you think that, oh wait, I can wait for the wage rate to decline even further. Remember, you are a hiring manager. Alongside making sure that people get employed, your bigger concern is that the firm has lower costs, right? So you might be inclined towards thinking that wages are going to drop even further. If you decide based on your expectations that wages are going to fall further, you might decide not to hire with the current change in labor supply. Think about what happens if there are many firms in the economy which do the same. How will this change the dynamics of employment and wages? And we will probably try to support this with some more data in the upcoming classes. The third case that I wanted to present in this class before we end the discussion is about the case where wages and prices are not elastic but they are inelastic. In this case, as compared to the previous case, wages and prices are determined to be at a certain level and they do not change. We'll discuss about why they do not change, but here is a small example to start off with the discussion. Again, a classic supply-demand curve. If you pay attention, we will again assume that this is a labor market, not a commodity market necessarily. So the equilibrium wage rate is at 50 and the equilibrium level of employment is at 6. Suppose there is a decline in labor demanded. So if the labor demand declines, that's shown by the left movement of the labor demand curve or the orange line. And there is going to be, according to the neoclassical framework, a lower level of wages and a lower level of employment. But is this always going to play out? Well, only if prices are flexible. However, if prices and wages are not flexible, which means that they cannot change over time, then you will have a scenario like this. In this case, what happens is that you have the same level of wages or the same wage rate, and what you will see is that you'll have a scenario where the supply of labor is going to be higher than the demand of labor. In other words, you do not move from this equilibrium to this point directly. Your wages are kind of kept at a certain level while your number of people employed actually goes down. Can anybody think of a name for this kind of a scenario? What in the context of labor markets do we call this? When the supply of labor is higher than the demand for labor, what happens in this case? Are more people employed than the people who are looking for jobs, or are less people employed? Correct. We're basically talking about an idea of how unemployment can persist. By the construction itself of supply-demand framework in the neoclassical sense, the idea of disequilibrium or the idea of unemployment is almost assumed to be non-existent. In fact, the reasons cited for why wages and prices might be sticky are often discussed in terms of government interventions. That government interventions are what prevent wages and prices from declining or increasing. Remember that the case for keeping wages at a certain level can come from various reasonings. We will discuss some of this in the upcoming slide. So think about the scenarios where wages and prices might be inelastic. One scenario that I'll suggest you guys can read this more about, we'll discuss more about this, is implicit contracts. So if wage bargaining is done through unions or as an individual, you might have an implicit contract with the employer that they cannot reduce your wages. And this is a good thing. The good thing, why this is a good thing, is because otherwise there would be fluctuations in wages which would be too high for anybody to even seek employment. On the other hand, if we move to the commodity side of things, you might have the example of menu costs. What are menu costs? Let's think of a scenario. How many of us here have been to restaurants? Most of us, right? So have you seen the menu of the restaurant changing every single day? We of course do not go to the same restaurant every single day, but even over shorter time spans, the menu of the restaurant does not really change. And when I say the menu doesn't change, I mean that the prices of what they are offering does not really change very rapidly over time. And this is especially true that if prices changed very rapidly over time, then the basic cost of printing that menu and having it across the board all the time is going to increase the costs of the restaurant itself. Think about today's scenario. You've been to many restaurants today. We do not really have a printed menu in many cases. They might have one or two, but basically now we take out our phone and we scan something and then we see the menu on it. Think about how that changes the explanation for price stickiness, or if that's a good reason to have to rationalize this idea of price stickiness. And finally, if you can think of other reasons, for example, I'll give you a hint. Maybe think about how investors will react to their investments into a business if that business has to keep changing prices every now and then of its products. One short graph that I wanted to show you to kind of show this entire idea of price and wage stickiness. This is taken from this paper, Sticky Wages, Evidence from Quarterly Microeconomic Data, where they look at two of these variables. One is the wages, the total wages of aggregate sectors across different quarters. Q1, Q2 are different quarters, and the second is they look at hourly wages below the minimum wage. And as you can see, the frequency of the wage change is not actually that much. In fact, on the left-hand side, if you're looking at the measure of the frequency, the mean or the average of this would somewhere be what connects all these dots, right? Another important thing which we'll discuss in the coming classes is why is it that the aggregate wage change, or the frequency of the aggregate wage change, is kind of lower than the dashed line, which is the frequency of the minimum wage change. Think about whether this is also something that can be rationalized in terms of our understanding about the labor markets. So, given all this, what are the main key takeaways from our lecture? Well, market equilibrium is just one of the possible scenarios. It is not necessary that it is a universal law. And I'm especially trying to emphasize this because in a lot of textbooks we are often told of the law of supply and the law of demand. And in many cases, this kind of becomes a very naturalistic approach towards economics, where you are talking about economics or laws in economics as, let's say, laws in physics. Which I would say is not the way in which social systems work. The supply-demand framework that we saw, we just discussed how static it is and that it is consumer-driven. The idea is that the consumer is sovereign to this entire framework. The demand for products is decided by the consumer, and that is what determines how things change. However, and the third point is going to basically emphasize that a little bit, supply and demand might not necessarily be the determinants of how the economy functions. In fact, they might be outcomes of the way the economy has functioned. Now, if you look at the examples we had discussed before, if you notice that there is a downward spiral in demand, that might be an outcome of the way in which herd behavior is prevalent throughout the economy. So it is not necessary that it is a determinant. Now, in all of this discussion, we have kind of taken this devil's advocate position of talking about supply and demand in the neoclassical supply and demand framework. This is not to say that this analysis is entirely irrelevant. The reason being that it lays a framework. Abstraction is one of the important aspects of economics, but those abstractions should be understood in the context of which they are placed. It's not that they are laws, it's not that they cannot be changed over time, and that is something to keep in mind. We will end the class today with this nice remark from Goodwin, which talks about how market equilibrium basically is something that the neoclassical way of looking at market equilibrium is kind of like trying to create a false idea that we are very good at predicting things. So the pursuit of precision at the expense of accuracy may give us a false confidence about how much of the real world can actually be understood. And these elegant simplifications, while they look very nice, they might not always apply to understanding real world scenarios. So thank you for coming to the class. The first book is what we are following. We have been following and we'll continue with this, and the graph was from this paper. If anybody wants a copy of this paper, please let me know. I will share it on Canvas. Thank you so much.